Dear BalkanPod listeners, I'm Dilek Kütük from Turkey. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my guest today, who's gonna talk to us about Russia and the Balkans. This week, my guest is Dimitar Bechev, who is one of the best researchers in the region. Mr. Bechev particularly focuses on Russian foreign policy towards the Balkans, also Turkey. He's a visiting scholar at Harvard University and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dear Bechev, welcome to BalkanPod.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's really wonderful to see you here. I'm so excited to have you as my guest.
Okay, it's pleasure is all mine.
Okay, let's start with the question about your book. Actually, I know you published a book which is Rival Power, Russia's Influence in Southeast Europe. And I know that for centuries, Balkan region is playing a significant role in Russia's foreign policy. And actually, Russia was always present in the region historically and culturally. And however, why is Russia a rival for your opinion?
Well, the history of Russian presence has varied across time because what we have as Russia today is not necessarily the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union was very different from Imperial Russia before. But my books really starts in the 1990s when Russia was trying to rearrange its foreign policy, mainly vis-a-vis the West, but also to react to challenges in Europe, with the Yugoslav war being the most important item on the European security agenda. But going forward to the present, Russia is a rival because it has elected to intervene in Southeast Europe as a way to make life difficult for NATO, but also for the EU to compete with the West. You look at the weak spots on the Western periphery and project your influence in order to gain geopolitical leverage. So this is very shortly what Russia's game in the region has been. Russia doesn't have that much by way of either economic or military resources. It's not a big presence on in the regional economies, except for the energy sector. It does have troops in the Balkans, in contrast to the 1990s and obviously to the Cold War period. But it exploits all kinds of opportunities in the region, from pro-Russian and anti-Western public opinion in some countries to friendly business and political elites, and also to general distrust in institutions and to the West, which opens the opportunity to use information warfare. So that's very shortly what my book discusses and how Russia tries to rival and to compete against the West.
And I'm wondering that, for example, Serbia is a very interesting case. It is the closest of the countries in the Western Balkans to Russia. And if we consider the EU's investment share in Serbia for many years, Russia is less actually. And you also prove this in your book. But the top issue to be discussed is always Russia in Serbia or Russia in the Balkans. Why do we discuss Russia so much in the region? Do you think that EU is exaggerating this idea in order to close the ranks and not to lose interest in the EU?
Well, there's an element of that, but there's, on the other hand, no denial that Russia is very much present in the region. And a very direct example is now early this year, on the 1st of January, President Vučić inaugurated this of Russia being in the region. I'm not sure that the EU is as concerned these days about Russian presence as it was later on in the middle of the 2010s. There's been a learning process, and now policymakers, but also analysts, are aware of what Russia does, but also the limits of Russian presence. What I notice lately, of course, is the growing interest in China's expansion into the region that, of course, now with the COVID-19 pandemic has become very, very visible, including in countries like Serbia. In some ways, China is stealing the show from the Russians, I think.
As far as I see, the level of Russian influence in the Balkans varies from countries to countries. Russia, already created its own channels of influence in the region via the Slavic and Orthodox Orthodox Christian nation. And however, Russia has a lack of connection with the Albanian world, in my opinion. Do you agree with this, or how would you evaluate this deficiency of Russian foreign policy?
Oh, that's right. Because at the end of the day, as my book argues, Russia's presence not because it pushes, but also because there is the pull factor. There is demand for Russian presence, and the demand is not very high in Albania or Albania sphere. And the same, by the way, is happening in Romania. If we want to enlarge the Balkans to include also the Romanians, the image of Russia historically is very poor. So there is not much by way of a Russian presence. But that doesn't mean that there are no opportunities. Russia is pretty flexible and has proven its readiness to cooperate with pretty much everyone. Of course, it's much easier with certain actors than with other actors. And it has reached out to Albanian politicians. There was, of course, the meeting between Putin and Hashim Taci of Kosovo in late 2018. Before that, the Russians cultivated links to Albanian President Musliu. So it's a mixed bag. Russia is not necessarily uninterested. It's just that there are not as many opportunities. One other point concerns Russian information campaigns in countries where actually you have this skepticism vis-a-vis Moscow. What Russian or pro-Russian outlets usually do is not to convey the image, to popularize Russia as an alternative to the West, but actually to portray West in negative light. So it's not that much a positive campaign to burnish Russia's image rather than denigrating the West. And that works also in Romania and in Albania, for instance, if you say that the West is promoting undermining conservative traditional values. That serves the Russian agenda of promoting discord and also distrust. So again, there's an element of flexibility in Russian policy.
And we know that Russia is one of the most important oil and gas exporter country in the world, and especially in the Balkans. It's like energy powerhouse, let's say. Anyway, currently Turkish stream, or let's say Balkan stream, is very heated topic in the region. How would you evaluate this project in terms of socioeconomic and political impact?
Well, it's more of the same because it doesn't change the structure of the market. It's the same volumes of gas going into the region, but the route has been altered rather than through Ukraine and Romania and through Hungary in Serbia's case. Now it's through Turkey and onwards, but essentially this is the same gas. What Russia is trying to do is to, of course, create alternatives to Ukraine as a transit country, but also lock in demand in Southeast Europe. But here's a caveat. These are countries that do not consume large amounts of gas. I mean, Turkey, of course, is the big market in wider Southeast Europe. But if you look at Serbia or Bulgaria, even Greece, these are relatively small volumes. They don't make a huge difference. The region's energy systems are based, or the energy mix is based on other sources, notably coal. And there's not that much prospect, at least in the short term, that demand for gas will rise. But nonetheless, it's a big success for the Russians. The project has moved forward. Now Serbia is clearly going to buy gas only from Russia in the foreseeable future. The situation in Bulgaria is somewhat different because of the southern gas corridor and prospects for LNG imports. But again, like you said, Russia is remaining the dominant player on the Balkans gas markets, with all the political benefits that flow from that.
What has changed in Russian policy on the Balkans? Like, what are the events that changed Russian policy on the Balkans?
Well, there have been various stages. The first stage, of course, was marked by the war in Yugoslavia and the Yeltsin presidency in Russia, when the Russians tried to be part of the international community, at some points compete against the US, but also cooperate. There was a Russian peacekeeping contingent within NATO when Bosnia welcomed S4 and I4 before. So that was Russia tried to be a security provider. Then when Putin came around, he actually downscaled Russia's commitments to the region. He was the one pulling out Russian peacekeepers from Bosnia as well as Kosovo in 2003. And even if lots of people are saying that the Kosovo intervention, when Russia got slighted by the West and couldn't prevent bombing, shapes Putin's mindset, his actions later on suggest that he was not terribly interested in this region. He thought Russia's policy needed to be elsewhere. But in the 2000s, Russia, of course, ended up re-engaging in the region because of all those energy transit projects, South Stream first and foremost, which is the predecessor of Turk Stream. The point about the 90s, but also the 2000s, as well as the present, and I'll get to this new stage that we are now in, is that it's not about Russia in the Balkans. It's always about Russia and the West. And the Balkans is a chapter in a bigger story about overall strategic relations between Russia on the one hand and EU and the US on the other. With energy in the 2000s, it was conceived as a more cooperative relationship, not necessarily competitive, because a lot of Western companies were also part of those projects. Russia was a difficult partner, but a partner nonetheless. That essentially changed with the Ukraine crisis, and this is the third stage that we are still living in of Russia's policy in the Balkans, where Russia switched to a more competitive mode because it saw the West as an essential threat, both NATO but also the EU. That was not the case before. EU was not seen as a threatening force, but with Ukraine, Putin changed his mind, or in the build-up to Ukraine as well. But the point about the Balkans is that the relationship on the ground in the region became much more competitive in the 2010s. And we're still living in this era where Russia, as I said, is trying to bring to bear all kinds of leverage, political, economic, and so on and so forth, to put a spanner in the works of the West, to prevent NATO, but also EU enlargement, to develop links to local elites and publics, and to position itself and also act as an alternative to the West. And that's something new. That was not the case in previous stages, I think.
Turkey and Russia can cooperate in the region. Like, what are their common and different points for you?
Well, the common point is that they're not the West. Russia, Turkey has redefined itself as an independent player, a separate center of power with its own interests and policies in the region. But there are, of course, very critical differences. One thing that I never try to say to interlocutors, but it's policy analysts or decision makers, is that Turkey is part of the region. Russia is an external power. I don't think it's fair, and I think you probably agree with that Turkey is classified in the same basket as China and Russia. China, but also Russia, external powers, Turkey, because of geography, history, and societal connections, it is connected much more intimately to the Balkans. It is a Balkan country, as well as a Middle Eastern and country and part of the Caucasus. So that's one difference. The second difference is that Turkish foreign policy at times competes with the West in the Balkans, but very often bandwagons with the West, and it's on the same wavelength, even now that we have multiple crises and relations at a very low point. The concrete example would be Turkish support for NATO enlargement, which hasn't changed. Turkey welcomed Montenegro and North Macedonia into NATO, and also Turkish support for the Western agenda for energy diversification. Now, Southern Gas Corridor would be one good example to that effect. And I think ultimately Turkey is supportive of EU enlargement in the Balkans because it brings economic benefits. We shouldn't forget that unlike Russia, Turkey is part of the EU customs union and benefits immensely from trade and investment opportunities that this affiliation with the EU brings. So Turkish position is ambiguous vis-a-vis the West in the Balkans. Again, it competes but also cooperates. Russia has become a competitor, full stop, and that's a clear difference to my mind.
Dear Bechev, thank you very much for being here. I hope it was good discussion for our listener, and I'm really happy to meet with you, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Dear listeners, see you next week, same day and same time.